Welcome to our audience here in Atlanta, the United States, and throughout the world. We are happy to host our virtual roundtable on ending sexual exploitation on the heels of a very successful summit that was hosted last week here at the Carter Center with former President Jimmy Carter hosting a very interesting gathering that included advocates, law enforcement officials, legislators, a very interesting collection of people who are really interested in how to combat human trafficking, sex exploitation, all of the harms that come along with the exploitation of human beings for sex. And just a teeny bit of background for our audience. Last year, President Carter wrote a book called A Call to Action, Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. And in this book, he began to write about and think about and talk about publicly how to end sexual exploitation. And he learned about, in the course of his own research for the book, he learned about a very successful model that has been put in place in Sweden and in the Nordic countries. We call it the Swedish model or the Nordic model, and contrasting it against other models where prostitution has been legalized in other countries, and came out with the conclusion in his own mind that the Nordic model or the Swedish model, which relies on decriminalizing the person who is in prostitution, but levying heavy penalties on the buyers of sex and on the pimps and profiteers, and also relies heavily on robust exit and care services for those who are in prostitution and public education campaigns, that this model is working to decrease exploitation. By contrast, in other places where we see legalization happening, we actually see an increase in abuse and in people in prostitution in New Zealand, etc. So President Carter took a very, very firm position. He also called for the global adoption of a UN convention against sexual exploitation, because if we don't do this in concert across many countries, across all countries, there will be safe havens, there will be ways to get around this norm that we are hoping to establish against sexual exploitation. So that is the background. And I just want to introduce our guest that we have today, which is just an amazing group that we've assembled today. Two of our guests today were with us last week. We have Dr. Gail Dines, who is a professor of sociology and women's studies at Wheelock College in Boston. She has been researching and writing about the porn industry for well over 25 years. Her latest book, Pornland, How Porn Has Hijacked Our Sexuality, has been translated into 5 languages. She is the founding president of Culture Reframed, a nonprofit dedicated to approaching the issue of the harms of pornography through public health strategies. And you can check out Dr. Gaines' recent TEDx talk. If you look for it on YouTube, it's called Growing Up in a Pornified Culture. I highly recommend it. It's an excellent TED Talk. Dr. Kathleen Barry is also with us today. She's been working on this issue for over 40 years. She is a sociologist and professor emerita of Penn State University. She is the author of Female Sexual Slavery, published in 1979, one of the first books to make the connection between human rights and prostitution, or prostitution as a violation of human rights. And the book, the 1995 book, Prostitution of Sexuality, The Global Exploitation of Women. She is also the originator, together with UNESCO's Division of Women's Rights, of the proposed UN Convention Against Sexual Exploitation. We're so happy to have you, Dr. Barry. Gunilla Eckberg is also with us. We're so happy to have her. She's been such a moving force behind the Swedish model. She's a Swedish-Canadian feminist lawyer and an international expert on human rights, gender equality, and trafficking in human beings. Ms. Eckberg held the position as special advisor on trafficking in human beings to the Swedish government for 6 years, where she was responsible for developing government, legal, and public policies on prostitution and trafficking in human beings. For many years, Ms. Eckberg was a social worker working with victims of all forms of violence against women and girls in a number of countries, including in Sweden, Denmark, the US, Canada, and she is the chair of the non-governmental policy and research group, the Institute for Feminism and Human Rights. I can't even believe we have such a great group after you worked so hard at our summit last week. We're so glad to have you. So we're going to go in that order because I want, I was surprised last week when I learned from Dr. Gail Dines how mainstream pornography has become so much more violent and harmful in recent years because of the internet than what most, I would say adults know about pornography, and that it's having this extreme effect on human trafficking and prostitution. And I never thought of those linkages before. I think it was very eye-opening for us. So we're going to hear from Dr. Gail Dines first, and then we're going to go on to hear from Dr. Kathleen Barry, who will explain how there is this link between a human rights framework to solving this problem and how that has legislative and policy implications. Then we will hear from Dr. Eckberg, who has worked on the Swedish model. So, Dr. Gail Dines, can you first tell us how has pornography changed in recent years so that it's so harmful to our youth, and what is the intersection with prostitution and trafficking?
Okay, well, good morning, and it's wonderful to be on with such esteemed guests. I've never actually met Gunilla, so hello. Let me begin by saying that when we talk about pornography, one of the things I often do is I ask people in the room, and these will be social workers, pediatricians, parents, I say, when I say pornography, what do you think I'm talking about? And often what I get back is, well, maybe pictures of people having sex, maybe breasts. And what you see is they're working with really a 15-year out-of-date image. That kind of stuff, and I never thought I would live to say this, is kind of quaint given what we have today. I mean, it was sexist as it was, it is incomparable to what we have today. So what changed everything was obviously the internet, because it made pornography affordable, it made it accessible, and it made it anonymous. And those three things were the driver of demand for pornography. Now what happened is that as the internet became domesticated, which, by the way, the internet was developed from much money brought in by the pornographers. It was no accident that the internet was developed as it was, because the pornographers were putting lots of money into developing live chats, into developing the screens, etc. So let's begin with the 12-year-old boy who put porn into Google. He thinks he's going to come up with breasts as well. He thinks he's going to come up with maybe people having sex. What happens is he is catapulted into a world of sexual violence and cruelty and torture that he's not prepared to see. Now let's just think about what happens. So he's thinking he's going to see breasts, and what he gets is, when I say cruelty, I'm talking about women being gagged with a penis till they're literally choking, the tears are streaming down their faces, they can't breathe, and for added sizzle in pornography they often hold her nose, so she's really choking, or she's being subject to such pounding anal sex that we know that one of the problems of women in pornography is that their anuses tend to drop out of their body, they get anal prolapses. So this is what he's catapulted into. And I want us to think about the trauma that then sits in that boy's stomach. A trauma of arousal, fear, shame, anger, and self-loathing. And it is that trauma that then drives him to keep coming back for more. Because when you have unresolved trauma, what you do is you go back to the site often at which the trauma happened. It's an excellent business model, by the way, because these are businessmen. So you now have sex education coming from the pornographers. It is literally the main form of sex ed all over the world. So then when you ask yourselves, how does a little boy become a John? How does he become a pimp? We have two choices. We either take the biological argument and say there is a hiccup in masculinity and men are born violent and abusive, or you take the feminist analysis, which is that men are socialized into a violent, abusive masculinity through the culture. And as a sociologist who studies media, I would have to argue that one of the key socializing factors is actually pornography. There is no way that you can bring up a generation of boys on pornography without this having a profound effect. We know, for example, that the fashion industry shapes the way people dress. We know that the food industry shapes the way people eat. How could the sex industry be the only industry in the world that does not shape the way that people behave? So here you are training young boys into a violent, cruel sexuality, so that when they start to eventually partner, heterosexual ones with women, they're going to want the kind of sex they've been brought up on in porn, which they've masturbated to over and over and over again, and which they have a traumatic connection to as well. Now, who are they going to go for that violent, abusive sex? Where are they going to go? They're going to go to that group of women that can't say no. And who is that group of women in our society who can't say no? It's prostituted women. And I'm going to say prostituted rather than trafficked, because I see so much intersection between the two. So they're going to go to prostituted women. So in fact, pornography is one of the major drivers of demand to prostituted women. The second thing we know is, and this is really interesting, because in the anti-violence world around feminism, we sometimes tend to silo our work. So you've got the anti-trafficking prostitution groups here, you've got those working against rape on campus, you've got those working against pornography. In reality, the sex industry doesn't silo its work. We are doing a real disservice if we silo our work. So what I would argue is, think about the women's lives in pornography. Pornography is prostitution with the camera going. The women in pornography often increasingly are beginning in pornography but are being pimped into pornography by what are called suitcase pimps in the industry. These guys basically go onto Craigslist and they get young women, often women looking at minimum wage jobs in the middle of nowhere, who think they're going to become celebrities, they're going to be the next Jenna Jameson, the next Sasha Grey. They then get them living in a house together, very much like a brothel, 5 or 6 young women, and the suitcase pimp then pimps them out to different pornographers. Now, what we also know is, because of the level of violence against these women, they only have about 3 months that they can survive in the porn industry, because their bodies just simply cannot take the violence. It is a very short bus ride from Los Angeles, which is the valley in LA where most of the porn is made today, to the brothels of Nevada. So really, the porn industry, the trafficking industry, prostitution industry, whatever you want to call it, they all work together. And they recycle women constantly, going from pornography to prostitution. That's generally more how it goes. Now, we also know prostituted women have porn made of them. We know that in the brothels, they use pornography as a way to season and groom the women into what kind of sex to do. So what I really try and do in my work is to pull the pieces together and stop siloing our work, which I know that the people on the panel have also been doing for many years, is putting the pieces together. Because unless we deal with this juggernaut called pornography, which is socializing an entire generation of boys, unless we deal with that, we are never going to stop prostitution and trafficking, we're never going to stop violence against women, we're never going to stop any of these things. So that's the connections that I make.
Gail, can I just ask you this, because this was another thing I heard from conference participants and people that I've been speaking with since the summit, is there is this kind of reaction, because this is so shocking what you're saying, that there is this automatic reaction that, well, my son isn't doing that, my boys aren't doing that, this is extreme porn. You're talking about something over there that I don't have a connection to. You're talking about a very small segment. Can you give us some numbers, some kind of a sense of the scale of this?
Can I say, I wish you were right. Honestly, no one more than me wishes that this was the extreme, and that you had to spend 20 minutes looking for this. The truth is, this is what you get to within 15 seconds. We know from what is the gold standard of a peer-reviewed article by Anna Bridges and her team, is that almost 90% of the top rented, looked at videos, scenes in pornography contain physical, sexual, and verbal abuse against the woman. I wish that this was the marginalized one. I wish I was exaggerating. But unfortunately, and this is how I started my book, Pornland, I put porn into Google. And what I decided to do was to follow the breadcrumbs of a 12-year-old boy with no credit card. And that is when you are catapulted into violence. Now, I tell you why people can't believe this. They can't believe this because we cannot accept that the pornographers have marched into our culture and hijacked sexuality to this point. Where have the adults been? They've basically been asleep at the wheel. And I think that is so awful. And to those parents who say, my son is not looking at this, I will tell you absolutely that your son is looking at this, and the pornography industry has your son in the crosshairs of their rifle.
So, this is, and I'm a mother of 2 sons, and so my antenna are up. I'm very worried. I have a 22-year-old who's been through it. I have a 10-year-old who's getting ready to go in to this age group. So I'm very attentive to what you're saying. And so I can tell you that what I've heard, not just from my son but from his friends, is that you're. I can testify to what you're saying because I've asked and I've at my horror learned that you're right.
Can I tell a little story? Can I just tell
Yes,
one story
please.
and then I'll end? So I went to give a talk in a law school, and the professor was really anxious because she thought I was showing some pornography, and she sent out emails over and over again to the class saying the slideshow has violent images of pornography, and I just warn you. I go and give my talk. Afterwards, this is in a law school, the women, as they always are grey, they're like sitting there, oh my God. And the guy puts his hand up and says, excuse me, why did the professor send out that email about this was going to be explicit and hardcore? This is what we always see. And the women are sitting there. They look like they've been smacked in the face, which they have, because when you see misogyny so clearly, you're literally, as a woman, smacked in the face. And the guys were sitting there saying, well, I can't understand why we got that email. So those stories I hear over and over again.
Yes, so here we go. And I think it's really important, Dr. Barry, if you could talk to us, how do we look at this in a human rights framework? Because some people say it's a woman's human right to sell sex, to prostitute, to be a prostitute, to be a sex worker. It's her human right. This is the human rights argument that is actually very popular right now. And so what you're saying and what our guests are saying and what we heard so much of last week was, wait a minute, you don't have the right to revoke your own human right to not be tortured, which I thought was an amazing statement. So talk to us about the human rights framework. Why do we need it, and what are the policy implications of that?
Okay, I want to pick up from what Gail has said and point out that normalization of pornography is, as Gail has very clearly pointed out, is not only what allows the society to accept prostitution as if it should be something like, say, called sex work, for example, another term that's used to normalize it. And what happens, unless we sit down and talk as we're doing right now, if we do not actually be explicit about what happens to those who are purchased in prostitution, we go on continuing to normalize it. And so what does happen? Very much the sexuality that Gail has just outlined in pornography is what men are buying in prostitution. So a man buys, and he buys whatever he chooses. He is the one who's in control. He is the one who calls all the shots. And what does he buy but the opportunity to degrade, to humiliate, to act out of disgust? Urinating on women is not uncommon. I mean, we could have a very indelicate program if we go into the details of this, the kind of anal sex that is in pornography, the fact of needing to degrade and humiliate women is essential to the buying of prostitution. I talked to somebody recently about this, and they said, but it's sex, and it suddenly dawned on me that people think that when men go to buy prostitution, they get together, they go into a hotel room, they take off their clothes, they get into bed, and they, quote, have sex, which is, us trying to appropriate a nice guy image into a very horrific scene. We know how damaging this is because we know how very few women ever recover from having been in prostitution. Women pull their lives together after they get out, whether they've escaped or just found a path for getting out. They'll pull their lives together, but there is damage that is beyond what we call post-traumatic stress syndrome. It is far beyond that in terms of destruction of the self. That's where we begin in looking at human rights, because that is what makes prostitution a violation of human rights, is men buying. It is not about women selling. Prostitution is not about women. Men are buying objects, commodities, to use as they see fit. And men, if you look at the research on men who buy, basically what they say is, when I buy, I can do whatever I want. And that's mine. She's mine. It's mine. She is a hole for me to penetrate. She is several holes for me to penetrate, or for us to penetrate. This is not only just kind of bad, unpleasant sex. This is using sex to abuse, to objectify, and to abuse other human beings. And in the process of doing that, especially when we talk about this as something that happens repeatedly, maybe a customer lasts for 10 minutes, maybe a customer lasts for an hour, maybe it's 4 customers a night, maybe it's 12 customers a night, maybe it's every night, maybe it's 5 nights a week. One of the things that we don't do as a society is say, what would happen to me if I was in that situation? People who kind of come up with the concern for how else are these poor young women and girls going to live if they don't have this job, have actually distanced themselves, saying, not even getting to the point of recognizing, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't ever be able to do that myself. The harm to me would be too grave. And so we turn to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is something I want to really suggest to people listening, if you want to get into this issue, to look at the kind of things that Gail is talking about, to look at what goes on in prostitution, to read some of the testimony of women who have been in prostitution, of what men are buying from them. And when you do that, you will see that if you pull up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, those rights are being flagrantly violated in the most profound and fundamental ways. And so it became our job some years ago to take a look at that Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the various treaties that have gone along with that, treaties through the United Nations that have gone along with expanding and enlarging our understanding and our working with human rights in the world, and to formulate an approach to human rights that would allow us to recognize prostitution as a violation. And so we took, as we're doing in this conversation, as we did in the summit that you had at the Carter Center with President Carter, we took all the forms of sexual exploitation, including prostitution, pornography, and trafficking, and put them together to establish a human right to live free of sexual exploitation. And from that, it would follow then that those who violate the human rights of another human being are then guilty of a crime against that person. And who violates the human rights of another human being? One of the things we've been used to talking about in the United States are the traffickers, because the traffickers are literally trafficking, as in trafficking of drugs, trafficking into prostitution. But when we look at what the function of the traffickers are, is to supply a commodity to the market. And in supplying that commodity to the market, they have then become one of the kingpins in this exploitation. But the center of it all, the foundation of it, the center of it, without which prostitution would not exist, are men buying women to sexually use and abuse. Without men buying, there would be no sex industry, there would be no prostitution. And so we focus then very, very clearly on men buying and looking at what comes out of that. And I think we have to take this, because when we're talking about this, and I'm skipping a step here, because in terms of dealing with men buying prostitution, I think the work of Gunilla Eckberg and the work around the Nordic model is the gold standard for the world today. And so I'm kind of going around that because I know she will go into it in much more detail. But I want to step back from this for just a moment to point out that what we tend to do as people is, instead of seeing this as a kind of collective condition that affects all women, in terms of pornography and prostitution, we treat it as an individual problem, an individual condition. What about that poor young woman who doesn't have anything to eat? What about that poor woman who is has no place to sleep and has no kind of income available to her? And we don't look for collective solutions when we get to an individual level. So what we tend to do then is say, well, at least she can get some income from prostitution. And do what with it? Spend the rest of her day, the rest of her week, the rest of the month, the rest of the year, the rest of her life sexually servicing men. Period. That's it. You finish, you go home, you go to sleep, you get up, you get something to eat, you go back on the street, and that's what you do. Bill Gates has built a huge base for normalizing prostitution in India by putting together a very strong condom distribution program, and claims great success because he has saved women from AIDS. Now, here's a businessman who could perhaps think of business models that would, in fact, get women out of prostitution. But what he has done is establish a program that keeps women sexually servicing sadists, for the most part, 4 to 5 to 6 to 10 to 12 a night, 5 to 6 to 7 nights a week. How long does a woman live with any kind of integrity of the self, being subjected to that over and over again? Now India wants to go toward the brothels, toward legalizing prostitution in order to expand the brothels. Germany has claimed that they have solved the problem of prostitution by putting women into brothels. This is the question that we need to ask. Under what terms do we as a society agree that men should have the right to buy human beings to sexually exploit and abuse? All of prostitution, all of pornography, all of the sex industry, all of trafficking is organized to serve that basic principle. And that's how Bill Gates organized his condom distribution program. It was not to help women gain new lives, to take some business models that he knows of, and we know of wonderful business models, such as the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, where we have vast numbers of women in poverty who are able to get into microcredit programs. No, he turns around and says, we accept prostitution as inevitable, and now what we're going to do is just make sure that the women don't get AIDS. See, we're taking care of their health. It's just like the argument, see, we're taking care of a job for them. What would they do if they didn't have the job? How would they be just left to die of AIDS if they don't have condoms? And of course we know that men don't use condoms. Bill Gates has wonderful research to show that the level of AIDS is going down. And for what? For the customers, not for the women. Because if you cared at all about the women, you would move that out of pro-prostitution, a perpetuation of prostitution situation, and you would put it into a situation where women can find a way to thrive. We know that this can work. We know that in Vietnam, that was riddled with prostitution at the end of the U.S. war against Vietnam. We know that that country turned around and practically eliminated prostitution in a period of really severe conditions. On the other hand, Thailand moved to take that same inundation of prostitution and normalize it. Now we have somewhere between, the figures change from year to year, but somewhere between 92 to 98% of men in Thailand who buy prostitution. That is the goal of the sex industry. And that is the goal, to serve male sexuality in those terms.
So that's very helpful to understand, and I think that's what we have to be thinking about, is how do we answer those basic questions and ask ourselves to examine what are the norms we're talking about, what are we willing to accept as a society. So I'm going to ask Gunilla Eckberg to talk about the Swedish model, because here we have something that's working, and when you describe it, if you could also talk to us about how communities where there really is not a social safety net, like in many U.S. communities or in very poor countries, how you can overcome that criticism that it's so dependent on the social safety net working, the Swedish model. So tell us what it is, how it works, and what are some of the challenges.
Good morning to you.
Good morning.
From Sweden. I'm delighted to be here. I think it's very interesting what you both have been saying, Gail and Kathy. What I think is important to recognize with our approach, and I prefer to call it an approach rather than a model, because approaches you can adapt to where you live. A model is square and inflexible. So I think that it is the principles and the ideas of where we want to go, what kind of society we really want to live. If we want to live in a society where actually men who are privileged have a right to purchase women and sexually exploit it, or we have a dream that we actually, like we have with other forms of violence, that we can end it. And we might not end it today, but if we have a vision that eventually that is where we're going, then we also adapt all the measures and actions we do in that direction. And so just to start out, I think it's important to recognize that our approach originally came out of the Swedish women's movement. As many, and I know Kathy and Gail have been involved in this. We had consciousness raising groups in the 70s who had issues were there by the pimps and the traffickers, but actually the Prostitution Act and what men who purchase and sexually exploit them do to them. And there was no hesitation from our side that what they were describing was another form of violence against women, committed mainly by men. And so we looked at the harm that was done to women individually, but we also very quickly started to look at it from a political point of view and saying, if individual women are harmed like this also has a harmful effect to society at large, and specifically to that goal that we've had now for, 45-something years in Sweden, that we are aiming that men and women in our society have similar rights and similar responsibilities and similar opportunities. And if we say that we're a democratic society, we can't at the same time say that women, the most marginalized and oppressed women in our society, should not have access to all of their citizenships, right? Because they are to be available for a certain percentage of men in our society where they can buy and sexually exploit. So that is kind of the underlying platform for what we decided to do. It is harmful both to women, and it is a majority of women, and it's harmful to society, and it normalizes a very serious form of sexual exploitation and violence as if it was nothing. And I think that I cannot underline enough that instead of listening to those who promote the prostitution industry, we need to listen to those who have experience and who have been in prostitution and who have been harmed. And I can tell you that I have not ever met a woman, no matter what political standpoint they have, who would say outright that they liked what they were doing. They are very aware of, they're very in their bodies, they feel it long after women have exited whatever prostitution activities they've been into. So anyway, so principles and visions are really core to how, if we want to change a culture of prostitution into a culture where we say that prostitution is a human rights violation, it is a crime, and it is clearly violence against women. And if we had time, we could go through and look at why it's violence against women, but just think about what's done. And so core to our approach is to look at the root causes of prostitution or the root causes of violence against women. And we look at the social, political, and legal conditions of women that needs to be ameliorated. And that is any society. It doesn't matter which society we live in. That is a core responsibility of those who are in power to minimize social injustices. That is as much in the US as it is over here. It is about redistributing money, because any society can say we cannot afford to do this, we have no social services. But in fact, if we're fighting to have a just society, we have to redistribute funds, and this is not very expensive. There is not millions and millions and millions of women in each community who are in prostitution. This is affordable, but it is saying that we have to shrink in some area to give money here, because it will benefit not just those women, but it will benefit the whole society if these women get the possibility of exit prostitution and become citizens and be able to work, as we all do, within a context and be politically active and so forth. I should say that the Swedish approach is about prevention. That is really core. So preventing women from being harmed by focusing on the demand as a root cause. So if men buy and sexually exploit women, if we can stop that before they do that, then we're successful. So legislation, as I'm sure you all know, has two purposes. It can either be a reflection of a norm that's already existing in the society. So, for example, we say it's not right to steal, or it's not right to murder. Or legislation can create norms because we have a further purpose that we want to change things in our society. And one way to do that is to pass legislation. And so we have laws that covers the whole chain of perpetrators when it comes to prostitution. So pimps, obviously. Traffickers, because pimps and traffickers work together. We do not separate prostitution from trafficking, but trafficking is just a form of transporting commodities to the markets where the demand is. And in that chain is also the men who purchase, because in the 16 years that we've had this legislation, we have only had males arrested or and prevented from buying. We haven't had one female of the 6,500 men who have been arrested so far. I forgot what I was going to say. Ask me quick.
So if one question about that, because I had a question to me today, two questions just popped in my mind from a conversation I had earlier. Why not just focus on the pimps in terms of prosecution? Why focus on the men buying? That's one. The second one is, why don't you just focus on the social services, because that's really the root of the problem? Like just, because that poverty is the problem, the lack of social service, that's the housing, all those. Why not just focus on those? Because, the rest of it, arresting men who buy, the rest of it is too hard. So those two things. Why not just focus on the pimp? And why not just focus on the social services part?
The U.S. has legislation to stop pimps, and it's not been successful.
Right.
And that is because it's not enough to just go after, because if you go after the pimps, then you have to have a very solid framework to attack brothel owners. You have to make sure that local communities don't have licensing system for strip clubs and other prostitution activities, because we know prostitution takes place that besides it's demeaning. So it's not, that is important, of course. It needs also to be enforced, cannot just be legislation. But if we took that reasoning and put it on other forms of violence, should we not criminalize men who batter the women they live with, for example? We know, and we do a lot of awareness raising, we do a lot of preventative work in all kinds. I could give you lists of things that's been done and is being done in Sweden to raise the awareness of men and boys not to purchase, not to use pornography, etc. But it comes to a certain point where we say, this is enough now. We need you to change your behavior, take responsibility for your behavior, and stop it. And if you're not willing to do that through knowing that this is not okay, then we need legislation. And the direct harm to the women in prostitution are the men. They are the ones who penetrate women. They are the men who tell women what to do. They are the men who says to women, "Oh, isn't it wonderful?" and make women smile, etc., etc. They are the ones who write on the websites for buyers about all of the women they have bought in the most demeaning and disgusting ways. And just relating it to Gail's speaking about pornography, I've spent a lot of time in chat rooms and on websites of buyers, and they have no problems selling mobile phone videos to each other of when they have been using women and talking about women and discussing women. So it's not, just as Gail says, this is not a benign activity. This is incredibly abusive, all of it. So if we don't want that abuse, and I think a lot of people you've talked about don't want to recognize what goes on in the brothel next door, even if it is an illegal brothel.
So then the second question is, well, why not just focus all of our effort? This was one question I got today. Why not focus all our effort on the social services side? Just make that, your main goal. Make sure that anyone who needs it has the care and services that they need. What's wrong with that approach? Just doing that without the rest of the policy.
Obviously, that is key and incredibly important to ensure that women have services, not just support services, but experienced exit programs where women have the option of leaving prostitution. But I just want to underline again, it's not women that causes prostitution. Women are not there because they want to be there. They are in situations that are being abused. Like, for example, abused by pimps and traffickers and buyers. Men will go to places where women are in difficult situation, and they will groom and recruit them. It is not the women, so you don't, because in Sweden we're not just focusing on the individual women, it's also what does it to society if we say that this is all right, that this behavior by men who buy and sexually exploit women is totally fine. But let's focus on the women. So you need to shift.
So you're each of you are talking about a shift in norms, and I think what I'm experiencing in terms of pushback from Americans who see it in a certain way, I think this is a very common way of seeing it, is that this is just, this is the way it is. It's the oldest profession. It's with us. It's always going to be with us. I heard Norma Ramos and others of you, I've heard this saying, it's not the oldest profession, it's the oldest oppression. And really the oldest profession, if it's related, is pimping, not selling. Yeah. So how do we overcome this attitude that it's going to be there, so you have to do harm mitigation? I know we've already talked about it, but if Gail or Kathy or you, Gunilla, have any other additional thoughts for those who are stuck on this point, just throw it in there. But
into reality, not by the myths that is promoted by the prostitution industry. Don't forget that this is a billion-dollar industry. They have an interest in promoting this business they're putting forward. because it brings in a lot of money. I have been involved in changing these laws in I don't know how many countries at the moment, but in every country where I've been involved and women have put forward an interest in changing the legislation to criminalize the buyers, immediately there are groups and individuals that pop up and who are arguing against it. And we know that many of those are related directly to the prostitution industry. Some of them are pimps. Some of them are controlled by pimps. I can give you many examples of women I have met who have been trafficked around, and every new place they have come to, the pimp has contacted media and said, I have a story for you. And then women have to sit there and be part of their own oppression by saying how much they like the buyers and how much they like what's done to them. This is not reality. We need to start answering the questions and breaking the myths.
Well, I heard this
from women who are marginalized, because that's also what it's about.
So Ken Roth, the head of Human Rights Watch, a couple of months ago tweeted out an article that talked about high satisfaction among sex workers, high levels of job satisfaction among sex workers, and you know, of course, I was, you know, just taken aback. So this is I understand that we have to answer this this perception and this understanding, but that's there, yeah.
Any research. When we do research with women who are in situations of harm, if you're going to get a true answer, women have to be away from the abusive situation. It's absolutely impossible for most women. If I was to, I used to work in shelters for battered women. If I went to the house of a woman who lived with an abusive husband, and he was there, and I asked her, how are you doing? She would not tell me the truth because there's too many risks. That is one reason. The other reason is that if you live in an oppressive situation, like in the prostitution industry, what is done to you is totally normalized. And thirdly, there are women who for all kinds of reasons, believe that this is an adequate way of making money, but that is a minute minority. So instead of, if we do social policy, social justice policy, then we have to, it's our responsibility to listen to those, the majority who are harmed.
Okay, Gail wanted to jump in here. Go ahead, Gail.
No. Yes, thank you. It would be like saying that we go to Walmart and speak to the associates who says they love working at Walmart as their manager has got his arm around the guy saying, yeah, you know, you work at Walmart because you like to hang out and say hi to people and you don't want a living wage. You've got to realize many of these women, when they're interviewed on the job or right next to their pimps, they have to go back the next day. They have to exist in that industry. And I've never known any progressive movement who has basically said it's okay to continue to oppress because oppression is always going to be there. Where would we be in terms of the labor movement? Where would we have been in terms of the civil rights movement or any movement if we started from the basic assumption that that form of oppression is completely normalized and is never going to go away? It's only when it's women's lives at stake that suddenly all of this bizarre argument that it's always been around and nothing's going to change, because when it happens to men we see the violence, and I think Norma Ramos brought this up over and over again. When it happens to men you see the violence. When women are the ones involved, it is absolutely rendered invisible and turned into something called sex.
And that's a strategy. I just need to interject here. That is a specific strategy of the sex industry, is to keep that focus on the women as if, because after all, we have a free market, which means free choice to buy whatever you want to buy. And by keeping the focus on the women, we divert our attention from where the cruelty, where the crimes are actually being committed. It would be as if we would go into drug abuse and look at those who are on drugs saying, oh gee, but you know, I like it, it makes me feel good, I can afford it, I managed to keep my habit going, and not pay any attention at all to those who are bringing the drugs in and making it available to those people. I think we have a very clear living example of the extent to which the sex industry controls and drives and defines what is called the sex worker rights movement. And that is with the issues we have taken up with Amnesty International. Amnesty had taken up a platform of decriminalizing prostitution so that there would be no crimes of pimping, there would be no crimes of buying, and there would be no crimes on the part of the women. When we as feminists protested this, and with a huge support from President Carter, who wrote a letter to the head of Amnesty International about what is wrong with this, we actually we had women going out all over the world into the general meetings in each country of Amnesty International. In most countries, the general meetings were around all of them were around the discussion of should prostitution be decriminalized. In most countries, it went like this. You get there, this is what the reports I got back from women in different parts of the world. You get there, workshops are already established by, quote, sex workers to explain and to talk about why it's important to their rights to have prostitution decriminalized. When you keep scratching back the surface on this, you find out that it's the head of major escort agencies who have put the sex workers in place in these organizations. And then they turn around and take this same model to the United Nations and go in, as Bill Gates did in India, go in with a condom distribution program to deal with AIDS in the UN AIDS division. And all of this is organized by and put together by the sex industry. This is not happenstance that women just, are prostituting one day and the next day they appear at the annual general meeting of Amnesty International for the United Kingdom or in Chicago for the United States. It doesn't work that way. It is part of a sex industry ploy. And I think that the point that's been made that's extremely important is that women in prostitution are not going to speak about their situation in the same way as those who have gotten out. And the parallel to the women who have been abused in their home is absolutely a perfect parallel there. So we have to be more intelligent about this.
So
and
let me,
Go
ahead.
Just the way to do that is to shift our whole focus from what about the women to the men who buy.
Right.
When you shift to the men who buy, everything then makes sense. Just one more point on this, and very quickly. Most women in this country, most women around the world, most women I would imagine working at the Carter Center and various other places are against rape. So we know what sexual violence and sexual abuse is. Then why would we tolerate that as being something that can be bought from women over and over again, every day, every night, time and time again? We know what it is. We know what sexual violence is. 1 to 3 or 1 in 4 women in this country have been raped. And so it's close to us. It's in our families. We need to look at the things that we know about that men do that is sexual violence to understand that the women in prostitution are victims of this and that this is what has to be stopped. And
go ahead, Gunilla.
Yeah, I think we need to talk about the men now because it's so easy to talk about women. And we will agree, of course, that women are harmed. But I think it's important also to listen to men who buy women for prostitution purposes and hear what they have to say about why they do it. And I think Simon Hexman must have given you some of those excuses that men use in Sweden just when they're arrested, which is my wife is pregnant and we haven't had sex for a bit, or I just felt like it. I've been involved in a big research project in Lebanon, interviewing with a women's organization that interviewed men who purchase sexual services over there. And what we can see is that men there, men in Sweden, in Scotland, in the UK, in the US, in Italy, and all over the other places where men who buy have been interviewed, have exactly the same reasons. They do it because they can. And then they have different approaches to what they want to do when they buy women. And another red thread that goes through all of those interviews is the absolute disdain and hatred that these men display against the women they actually purchase and sexually exploit. There is no generosity around that. And also I think it's important to listen to what men say, and this is also the same in Sweden as it is in other countries, of what would stop them from buying. And the first and most important in all of this research is that if there is legislation that would penalize them for buying and sexually exploiting women, then they would stop.
Yes.
And they would stop because it's not just because it is a crime and they would actually be having criminal records, but they would also because it becomes public. All of the cases here are public as any legal in any legal system, so they would be very visible. So why don't we listen to them? They know that if we do this, they will stop. We have, I think it's important to remember, we've arrested 6,500 men since the law came into place. Not everyone is arrested, but they get a telling off and not to do with. And that includes investigating over the internet and using all of those resources to find places where men actually buy and exploit women. I think that prostitution is about men. It's about male power in society, and men using that power and privilege as they see fit, and how they organize their sexuality. And a big part of when we were working on it the most intensively, when I was the special advisor, was to look closer at male sexuality and men's idea that should not be controlled, that it is a force that cannot be stopped and needs to come out somewhere, where men organize themselves and actually question each other and discuss with each other to change their behavior. For me, I'm not so interested in the reasons why. I'm interested in that particular behavior is stopped.
That's right. And so we're coming to the end here. We've only got about a minute left, and I know that Gail has to leave. So let me just ask you quickly to wrap up, and if you have one recommendation for people to work on as they can, just if you could offer resources. I know that the prostitution research education website that Melissa Farley runs has lots of great resources and information that I've gone to quite a lot to learn the basic facts. If you could each, give a little shout out to what resource you'd like people to go to. Let me first start with Gail, who might need to sign off, and then to Kathy, and then Gunilla can wrap up for us.
Thank you. I would suggest you go to stoppornculture.org, also gaildines.com. There's a lot of stuff around pornography and its harms. And also, by the end of the year, our new NGO, Culture Reframed, and we actually have now the skeleton up, will be going live with public health programs to parents specifically on how to build resilience and resistance in youth to the porn culture, because what we're trying to do is to stop it before it happens. And as pornography is a major socializer, we want kids to be able to have that resistance and resilience to being hijacked by the pornographers.
Perfect. And Kathy, over to you.
Right. I want to pick up very specifically on the Swedish approach again, to point out one of the things that we learned at this summit with Simon Hagström from Sweden is how easy it is to actually put the Swedish model in operation for law enforcement. Buying prostitution in the United States, for the most part, is illegal. If we had our law enforcement focusing on going after the buyers, and starting to build up a change in our laws where we take the laws off of the women, go after the buyers. We already have the laws on the books for that. We would have a huge movement in this direction that could be very powerful, at the same time that we would be building programs to provide support for women. And we have programs in this country, throughout the country, organized primarily by women who have been in prostitution as survivors, who know the services that women need very much. So that we have these resources available, we need to start believing that women have the right to them and men don't have the right to buy. You could check for more of the work on the global human rights approach to prostitution. There's a website, abolishprostitutionnow.wordpress.com. On that website, I have an article on why prostitution is a violation of human rights, and in that article there is a link to the Convention Against Sexual Exploitation that we've been working on. We also, for those of you who are continuing to work on these issues, we also have a Facebook page for Abolish Prostitution Now, where work that is being done, reports that are coming out, are constantly being updated for anybody who gets involved in this and has a means to be getting, that's a means to get updated on these issues.
Thanks, Dr. Barry. And Gunilla, last word over to you.
I think it's important to look at the changes that are taking place, for example, in Europe right now, where countries like Germany and the Netherlands, where the women's movement and some politicians are actually questioning what is going on in the legalized system. And we don't have time to talk about that now, but I think that is incredibly important to look at that grassroots movement that's happening. Secondly, Sweden is no longer, Norway and Iceland are no longer the only countries that have this law. I was involved in Northern Ireland, where they actually took the learnings from us, or our three countries, and implemented it into a larger human trafficking and sexual exploitation bill that will come into force in June, where there is a legal responsibility for the government to provide support services. Mm-hmm. And this is a country that is not rich, that doesn't have a lot of money, but they are committed, fully committed to do that, and fully committed to challenge the demand and arrest men and give them high fines. And thirdly, as you said in the beginning, I am part of a research group called the Institute for Feminism and Human Rights. We have a website that is currently being built, but there is information about Sweden, a long brief that I have written on all of the aspects of our approach, and there's also information about the Netherlands and other countries, and a critique of that.
Wonderful. So just to wrap up, we here at the Forum on Women, Religion, Violence, and Power at the Carter Center, this website platform will be building an interactive platform where viewers will be able to view this and other roundtable discussions in the future. They'll be curated there, along with content, resource links, and the ability of the audience to interact with experts like you, because we really want to keep this going. So thank you very much to our panelists. Dr. Gail Dines had to leave. She had to leave for the airport, so thanks to Gail. Thanks to Dr. Kathleen Barry and to Gunilla Eckberg. We appreciate your participation, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks for our next roundtable discussion here at the Forum on Women, Religion, Violence, and Power at the Carter Center. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.